Hello, everyone. I'm Annie Cartwright, one of the partners in Husch Blackwell's higher education practice. Before we start today, I'll cover some housekeeping. At the bottom of your audience console, there are multiple icons that will help you throughout the program today. If you have any questions during the webcast, please submit via the question box. We'll try to answer any questions we can today. Otherwise, we'll follow up if we're able after the presentation. A PDF of the presentation is available in the program materials folder, and this program has been approved for continuing legal education credit. For those of you who are live, report your hours by clicking the CEU icon at the bottom of the screen. A certificate of attendance, including course numbers, will be emailed to you tomorrow, along with a recording of the webcast for watching and sharing. Towards the end of the program, be sure to complete our short survey. We really do use your feedback to plan future programs that may be helpful to you or your team. And with that, let's get started. I will introduce our presenters today. Joining me are my colleagues Karen Cortu, Senior Counsel in our Chicago office, and Catherine Tierney, one of our fall law clerks who is also in the Chicago office. Karen advises a variety of institutions on a broad range of higher education matters, including, conveniently, research compliance, misconduct investigations, and developing systems aimed at preventing challenges in those areas. Her years of experience as a litigator give her some unique insight into the nuanced issues that arise in this context. Catherine, who has her Juris Doctor degree and has passed the bar, congratulations, Catherine. She'll be sworn into the bar next month, and she chose a legal career to make the world a better place. And there aren't a whole lot of areas where we're sure we're doing that in law, except education. And she entered law school with the idea of practicing in the area of education, and was surprised to learn and pleased to learn how broad the education field is. She looks forward to providing legal counsel after next month on a wide array of regulatory law, including research compliance, and helping mission-driven schools reach their students and fulfill their missions. With that, I will hand it over to Karen to start our presentation.
Well, thank you, Annie, for that helpful introduction and for joining our program today. By the way, Annie and I are planning to attend the NACUA workshop next week in Washington, D.C. on the topic of sponsored research and technology transfer, and we hope to see some of you there. We thought it may be helpful to start with a poll question, which aims to get at the very wide breadth of experience of our audience members today. If you could, please just set down your lunch for a moment, click on the option that best describes your primary role at your institution, understanding that many of us wear multiple hats and your answer is not going to be reported back to your colleagues or to the IRS. The options are A, legal counsel, B, general compliance and/or risk management, where research compliance is just one component of your responsibilities or perhaps not a component at all. C, research compliance or any other research-specific role, such as a research integrity officer, or D, none of the above. I'll give a few seconds for us all to post our answers. Okay, wrapping up. Let's see what we've got. Nice even division here. We have nearly 40% legal counsel, about 20% general compliance, 26.4% research compliance, and 15.3% other. I'm extremely curious about the other category and hope you find some value in our presentation today. It looks like we have a handful of attendees who are deep in the weeds of research compliance, about a quarter. But there's also a core group of attendees who are either attorneys or administrators or other team members who may be familiar with research integrity issues at a high level, and some folks who are even brand new to research issues. So our goal will be to provide information in this webinar that's meaningful and understandable to each of you. We'll do our best to provide more background where needed or to answer more detailed questions offline if you would find that helpful. So before we begin to address the main topics of our presentation, we wanted to address a question that may be at the forefront of your minds. Why are we talking about research misconduct now? Has there been a significant regulatory change that we need to know about? I hope we did not send you into any kind of panic. For purposes of our discussion today, the answer is not really. We should mention here that on August 29th, ORI, that's the Office of Research Integrity within Health and Human Services, issued a request for information, capital R, capital I, request for information, seeking input on the current policies on research misconduct located in the regulations. And they said that this was to help structure ORI's future plans to revise the regulation. So this is more of a brainstorming process. ORI said that it intends to start a regulatory revision process in the near future using conventional rulemaking processes, so presumably a NPRM, notice of proposed rulemaking, and so forth. And responses are due by this Monday. So if you're just hearing about this now and want to participate, the time is now. But really what we wanted to mention this for is that ORI is in the very early stages of potentially making some changes, which may be appropriate considering that many of the definitions and standards in this area were developed as early as 2000, which would be Y2K. So Catherine, please do not tell these nice people how old you were then, because some of us do not want to be reminded of our seniority. But this, because I know the answer to that, this is a topic where it's worth staying current. So depending on your role, you may be responsible for helping to foster a culture of research integrity on your campus, which we'll discuss later. You may be someone who will be in the position of evaluating allegations of research misconduct, where it's helpful to know how those things have been viewed in the last couple of years by courts and by the agencies. You may be asked to evaluate new threats or propose remedies to research misconduct, even software that your institution might be considering. So it's important for all of us to stay up to date on what's going on in research misconduct. Now, on the subject of ORI, a while ago, a friend tipped me off that the ORI annual report can sometimes be illuminating about the direction of that office. And it's also just nice to be reminded that that office is incredibly small for the breadth of work that they handle, which is sometimes good to keep in mind. So Catherine's going to discuss some of the specific cases handled by ORI over the last couple of years, but just as an overview, ORI reports that in fiscal year 2021, which turns over on October 1, its cases resulted in 51 administrative closures, 13 findings of research misconduct, 25 cases declined to pursue, and 6 findings of research misconduct. Those 6 cases all involved falsification, 4 also involved fabrication, and 1 achieved the trifecta of falsification, fabrication, and plagiarism. ORI also undertook 38 compliance reviews in 2021, 20 from prior years and 18 new ones. 15 of those were closed in 2021, and 23 of them go on. Now that's a lot of numbers. I hope you weren't trying to take notes. We'd be happy to provide that information to you later, but suffice it to say that it's roughly in line with prior years and that all of this information is available in the ORI 2021 annual report. So turning back to our question about the timing, there's also been some new research on the prevalence of research misconduct, and we'll share those results with you as well. Spoiler alert, there's reason to believe that research misconduct happens a lot and even more and more. Finally, some cases, trends, and developments to provide on-the-ground context for our observations. So Catherine and I developed today's presentation pretty organically, reflecting on the kinds of questions we've received from clients, and also the most interesting topics we've come across in the literature. So we'll start with a very brief review of what we're talking about when we talk about research misconduct. We're opting not to walk through the nuts and bolts of the inquiry and investigation processes, addressing allegations of research misconduct, except to the extent that they're relevant to some of the hotter issues or recent cases. Then we'll discuss the scope of the problem, meaning new developments in what we know about the prevalence of research misconduct, and also some new information developed about traditional and emerging forms of research misconduct. Catherine will discuss some recent cases of note, and that's intended to both bring you up to speed and also to provide some on-the-ground context for some of the broader observations that we'll share. And based on all of this, we'll share some thoughts on managing risk, focusing especially on some of the claims actually litigated over the last couple of years. And finally, we'll explore the obligation to foster a culture of research integrity, sharing some ideas from the literature and some of our own ideas. Of course, these are intended only as considerations, not advice as to whether a particular practice would be effective on your campus. And that is just a typical disclaimer. We're not giving you legal advice on what you absolutely must do. So we'll start by defining our key term for today, research misconduct. Now, for our purposes, we'll use the well-established definition that comes from the federal regulations. Those of you with exposure to research misconduct on your campuses are all too familiar with this definition. Here it is. Research misconduct means fabrication, falsification, or plagiarism in proposing, performing, or reviewing research, or in reporting research results. And here is the elaboration of that definition. We have fabrication, falsification, and plagiarism defined here. Let's see. Sorry about that. For some reason, the slide I'm seeing is not showing those definitions. But those definitions were established in 2000, and they are still used today. Though part of our thesis today is that it's worth tracking how ORI, courts, and other institutions may be employing them. I could read those to you, but I think instead I'll just direct your attention to its 42 U.S. Code Part 93.103 for those definitions, but you probably already know them. Excuse me. And I think Catherine will probably chime in later today to note that even though it's good to keep on top of how these definitions are being interpreted by courts and by agencies, most of the publicly available cases of research misconduct do not fall into a gray area and are not amenable to interpretation as honest error or as differences of opinion. And here's the last piece of the puzzle for our purposes today, keeping it relatively streamlined. A finding of research misconduct requires not only that the conduct fit the definitions that are in that regulatory code, but also that there must be a significant departure from accepted practices of the relevant research community, that the misconduct must be committed intentionally or knowingly or recklessly, and the allegation must be proven by a preponderance of the evidence. Which leads us to our next poll question. In honor of ORI's recent request for information, we thought we'd gauge this group's preferences. So if you're able to chime in for just a moment, here's the question. What particular aspect of the federal research misconduct policy would you most like to see changed in the future? Or is it working pretty well as it is? So think of this as just sort of like a BuzzFeed quiz. You can only change one. What would you change? I will say there's a compelling article in the Journal of College and University Law from 2016 in which the author, who's Gary Marks, advocates for a higher evidentiary standard than the preponderance of the evidence standard. Although query whether with a higher evidentiary standard, we'd want to notch up the sanctions as well. Just a thought for future discussions. In any event, I will give us a few more seconds for folks to think about what change they would like to see, if any. And once we have enough responses, we'll look at the results. Okay, let's check it out. Another very even split. So folks would love, 16% said, closer to 17% said change the definition of research misconduct. 45% said change the investigation procedures and timelines. 16%, the lowest amount, were on board for changing the standard. And 23% said, let's not make any big changes to any of those three categories. All, I think, very justifiable. And I will say that in our experience, if you get to the investigation phase of addressing research misconduct, and you have like a faculty committee that's involved in that investigation, I think those folks have found it easier to understand and apply the preponderance of the evidence standard. I don't know if it would work as well with a higher standard, but it's hard to know, just sort of my anecdotal observation. Anyway, thank you for weighing in on that. It's very interesting. And another time we can talk about what about the investigation procedures you would want to change. They are awfully detailed. So before we move off the topic of defining research misconduct, we wanted to address QRPs, or questionable research practices. QRPs may or may not fall into the definition of research misconduct. For example, in a 2006 paper on the ethics of research, the authors quoted a researcher who described an episode in which it was clear that the researcher had discarded certain results, like data that they had generated in their test, on the grounds that they, the researcher, were so experienced they just knew when they had a spurious result. And on one hand, yes, there is a certain amount of art to scientific inquiry and research. On the other hand, I hope many of us, like me, sort of gulped when we heard that. So some examples of QRPs, and pardon my voice, it's just the remnants of a cold, are the use of inappropriate controls. And I've got a nice source for that if you're interested on the slide. Neglecting or excluding negative outcomes, which is sort of similar to what this researcher was doing in that example. Or based on our experience, we would propose adding to this list certain basic lab practices, such as failing to properly store or maintain original data results or slides, things like that. Excuse me. In our experience also, when an investigation reveals instances of data fabrication or falsification, it probably also reveals some QRPs that either facilitated or maybe concealed the research misconduct. So what should we do about all this? It's hard to say because we know there are resource constraints. There's also a norm I think many of us share in our institutions against prying into faculty research more than necessary. But I would say that institutions that are aware of QRPs should strongly consider what else can be done to both learn the extent of those practices and determine whether any more egregious practices or research misconduct is implicated. Because you would hate to know about sort of the tip of the iceberg of the problem and not look into it enough to figure out that there was something even worse going on. So now that we've reviewed what we mean by research misconduct, let's discuss what we're calling the scope of the problem. So here we mean to explore some newly published analyses on the prevalence of research misconduct and how it comes about. Research misconduct is one of those areas where every year seems to have more cases than the one before. And we all do the same sort of clucking about it. We point to funding pressures on researchers, increased competition, and the the loss of equilibrium between the growing research enterprise on one hand and the availability of quality checks on that research on the other. We also point, perhaps optimistically, at the possibility that we're actually just getting better at catching research misconduct, or our reporting rates are getting higher, or maybe that at the very least, awareness of research misconduct in the scientific community is on the rise. In a hearing that we'll discuss in a little bit, Chris Graff, who is the Research Integrity Director at Springer Nature, testified in July that 5 million peer-reviewed scientific papers were published in 2021. And about 4 in 10,000 peer-reviewed scientific articles are retracted at some point after publication. So those numbers are fairly staggering at this point. There's also an interesting new sort of meta study conducted by an author named She and their co-authors, in which, that's XIE, I hope I'm saying it properly, in which the authors pool and analyze certain estimates of research misconduct in QRPs, and they arrive at estimates that the prevalence of self-reported research misconduct was about 2.9%. And for QRPs, it was 12.5%. That estimate was even higher with respect to researching self-reporting misconduct that the subjects had witnessed by others. So in other words, folks were asked, have you ever seen somebody else engage in research misconduct? And that estimate is 15.5%. It's a very interesting study. If you are inclined to use it for any purpose or quote it, I would encourage you to review it before throwing the statistics around, because there's some nuances there, but at least it gives us sort of the most up-to-date glimpse into potentially the rate at which this is happening. And we can infer from that, and in fact, ORI confirms that there is a significant issue with underreporting of research misconduct. So to illustrate some of the inputs to research misconduct, here's a screenshot from a virtual seminar put on in October 2020 by the NIH. And here, a scientist investigator from ORI, you can see her up in the upper right-hand corner, describes what leads to research misconduct. Some of this is fairly intuitive, but Catherine and I found it valuable to see the information presented this way. So these are actual statements from interviews that ORI conducted. And I will say that from some of our experience, often the investigation suggests that it's a combination of these sorts of factors that leads to research misconduct. So we have in the upper left competitive pressures, often in the context of getting a job or keeping a job or getting promoted, personal circumstances that it maybe exacerbate or create their own pressures, individual psychology, where folks can sometimes rationalize some of their actions in engaging in research misconduct. Poor supervision, we see this an awful lot in settings that are particularly hierarchical and there are junior researchers coming in, perhaps with either an environment where that is not conducive to their learning or their supervision, or one in which there can be, actual actionable misconduct going on separate and apart from the research misconduct, such as discrimination or harassment. And finally, inadequate training. We see this all the way from PIs down to the most junior person in the research setting, that sometimes there's just inadequate training on proper practices. And that's an area where I think our institutions can really find opportunities to take affirmative steps and try to prevent research misconduct before it starts. Now I'd like to turn it to Catherine for a moment just to share a helpful framing of this issue that she found in the literature.
Thank you, Karen. Yes, I think this is kind of a helpful framework put together by two experts in research misconduct, C.K. Gonzalez, who's the director of the National Center for Professional and Research Ethics, and Aaron D. Robinson, an expert on design and research at the National Center for Professional and Research Ethics at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. So two big experts in this field put together this article in Nature talking through nine different temptations and concerns in research misconduct. So we'll talk through each of them. First is temptation, and this pitfall arises when individuals are in situations where they could benefit from research misconduct if it was not discovered. Next is rash person justifies their misconduct by minimizing it. Third is ambition. This misstep occurs when a professional feels that they need the prestige of a big discovery or an important publication. Next is group and authority pressure, which Karen touched on a little bit before. And this pitfall arises when researchers allow one another to commit misconduct because the researcher committing the misconduct is more senior or because everyone else is letting it happen, so I don't need to speak up. Next, we have entitlement, which occurs when a person feels that they have earned the recognition that comes with publishing false research. Then there is deception, which is a misstep that arises when a researcher convinces themselves that the data should have come out the way that they hoped, even if it didn't. Next is incrementalism, and this pitfall occurs when a researcher commits a small piece of misconduct, doesn't get caught, and then moves on to make bigger and bigger fabrications. Next is embarrassment. Again, Karen touched on this a little bit before, which occurs that when a researcher is afraid to admit that they don't know how to do something or afraid to admit that they've made a mistake. And so they go along with it and let the mistake or the faulty practice occur. And the last one is, I think, the funniest name, eloquently titled stupid systems. And this misstep arises when institutions have implemented systems which actually encourage misconduct and undervalue or don't prioritize research integrity. So if you look at this, it creates a fun mnemonic. Oh, sorry, I'm trying to switch the slides here. There we go, called tragedies, which is a helpful way to remember it. And I think it's a helpful way to evaluate areas where your institution might be susceptible to research misconduct. And by identifying which of these areas in which your institution might struggle, you can begin creating a culture shift to promote research integrity. I'll hand things back to Karen now.
Thanks, Catherine. So as we're thinking about the scope of the problem, one aspect of that is how is it occurring? How is research misconduct? What form is it taking? So fabricating and falsifying data remain the most prevalent forms of research misconduct, from what we can tell. Within that category, an outsized number of reported research misconduct cases involve the fabrication or manipulation of Western blot data, which is generated according to this handy graphic. Ultimately, for those who haven't worked with it, Western blot data looks a lot like sort of blobby lines with different proportions, and they tell the researcher about the presence of certain proteins. Why Western blot data is so often the sort of focal point of research misconduct, we can theorize about it. Anything that's image-based is a little bit easier to manipulate and harder to detect. Whereas plagiarism, we have lots of advanced sort of software for picking up copies of text. So that's one thought about it, but I'm sure there are other reasons as well. It also just happens to be incredibly common in some of the fields where research misconduct happens the most. In addition to the more familiar forms of research misconduct, there are some newer forms that are gaining ground as well. And the most notable of these is the proliferation of so-called paper mills, which are, there's different ways to define them. We generally think of them as a commercial organization or enterprise that provides some service to the author of scientific and scholarly publication. Often what they do is sell authorship credits for fraudulent papers that get placed in academic journals. So this often includes fabricated data and manuscripts. Tools that the paper mills often use is they will use some of the cutting edge AI assisted software that can you can feed it a bunch of articles in a certain area. It kind of learns the language of, and the paper mills have a certain template for each. They seem to have a template for each type of paper, and then the AI software can kind of spit out this completely made up paper using either recycled or old or fabricated data. And it looks like a paper you might pick up that was legitimately created. So that's one thing they do. They also can do image manipulation, sort of very advanced Photoshop and things like that, using images that they pull out of existing papers or that they're able to find elsewhere. And they can just sort of fit it to how they want the paper to look. Related to and also sometimes sold by paper mills is some forms of gamesmanship within academic and scientific publishing. One form of this is like a citation ring, where colleagues agree to aggressively cite each other's articles so that it sort of artificially inflates the number of citations of their work. There's a great essay on this from 2020. I'd be happy to share with you, by Mario Biagioli. We'll talk in a second about other ways that these paper mills can sort of corrupt the publishing process. Part of why we know so much about this is because over the summer, the U.S. House of Representatives Committee on Science, Space, and Technology held a hearing titled Paper Mills and Research Misconduct, Facing the Challenges of Scientific Publishing. One of the witnesses at that hearing, Dr. Jennifer Ann Byrne, who was the professor of molecular oncology at the University of Sydney in Australia. That's her on the left of this slide. Oh, sorry, next slide. Yep, that's her. She testified that the threat of paper mills to scientific publishing and integrity has no parallel in her 30-year scientific career. So she and her colleagues did some research, and according to that research, which involved screening nearly 12,000 human gene research papers. That's sort of her area, so she used that as the test sample. They screened for gene sequence errors that were in these papers that would be associated with paper mill support. Of the 12,000 that they tested, over 700 papers had those sorts of errors that were likely to signal paper mill involvement. And that result led her to estimate that the number of paper mill contributions to the scientific literature on just the human gene, let alone every other area of science, could exceed 100,000 original articles already. So at this hearing, the witnesses and also the representatives discussed some of the potential pitfalls with paper mills and why this is a big problem. A couple of these were discussed particularly by the ranking member, Representative Obernolte. And here's a couple that I think we should be particularly concerned about. Number one, the possibility that our institutions are rewarding fraudulent research with either a diploma or another credential or a promotion or a raise. So there's a need to identify fraudulent research and to assess consequences for those trying to capitalize on it. The other concern, and this was the subject of some debate, was the impact of these fraudulent papers on research integrity. So on one hand, Dr. Byrne said, these papers are sufficiently plausible, like the paper mills do a good enough job impersonating a real paper, that they could mislead people, especially early career researchers. And I think there's a concern that on a broader level, it's not that it will change how someone else's research comes out, but it may change where a researcher chooses to invest their time and their research. So if they think either a topic's already been covered or a topic is particularly hot right now based on all the papers they're seeing just by volume, that might help them make decisions that are influenced by these fraudulent papers. You might be wondering how these fraudulent papers even get published when there's usually at least an editorial review and often also a peer review component before publication happens. Well, one way is that some of them are pretty good, but more often there's a corruption in the process. So Dr. Graff testified that paper mills get around editorial review and peer review, sometimes through identity fraud. So they will place a fraudulent guest editor or a fraudulent peer reviewer. They'll impersonate someone who actually should have been the guest editor, who has the requisite expertise. They'll impersonate a legitimate researcher and then approve the paper and push it through quickly. So it's a problem with a lot of sort of tentacles to it, but the hearing did identify a few steps already underway to address it, which gives us some confidence. Number one, there's something called the STM Integrity Hub, which is a platform for journals to share dedicated fraud detection tools among themselves. One tool, for example, is something that flags when one paper is simultaneously sort of blast submitted to multiple journals, because that can be an indicator of possible paper mill activity. So there's that solution. Another solution is there's just an international community of concerned researchers who are volunteering their time to identify fraudulent papers. And a lot of this is happening informally and not in any kind of systematic way, although maybe that's happening down the road. And then finally, technology is just getting better. So as the paper mills have better and better AI for impersonating an academic paper or a scientific paper, the technology available for catching those papers, sort of automatically flagging them, is also getting better. So there's a bit of an arms race going on where it's sort of a cat and mouse between how good the fraud can be and how good the fraud catcher can be. So I didn't mean to scare you with all the paper mill talk, but it should be on your radar. And now that we have a sense of where things stand with respect to research misconduct, Catherine's going to drill down on some specific matters. She's discussing these at a fairly high level for purposes of our 1-hour presentation. We know that you realize each case is layered with many of its own details and circumstances, but hopefully these will give you the takeaways that you need.
Great, thanks, Karen. As Karen was saying, we're now going to discuss research misconduct as reported by the Office of Research Integrity, or ORI. In the last 3 years, ORI has released 21 case summaries detailing instances of research misconduct. The most common misconduct was falsifying and fabricating data, which occurred in 20 of the 21 instances. 1 instance involved plagiarism, and 2 instances involved both falsifying and fabricating data and plagiarism. When a person is found responsible for research misconduct, there are a range of sanctions that ORI can impose. Most cases involve a period of supervision. The institution is usually responsible for providing senior faculty members to supervise the respondent. And in the past 3 years, periods of supervisions have ranged from 1 year on the low end to 12 years on the high end. Although in theory, a lifetime ban is possible, most periods of supervision are between 2 and 4 years. Most cases also require that the institution submit a certification to ORI that the data provided by the respondent are based on actual experiments or are otherwise legitimately derived, and that the data, procedures, and methodology are accurately reported and not plagiarized in the application, report, manuscript, or abstract. So this all requires a lot of oversight on the part of the institution. In addition to those sanctions, occasionally the respondent is asked to submit requests to have affected work either corrected or redacted in publications, or retracted rather, in publications, but not always. And finally, the respondent is almost always required to exclude themselves from voluntarily serving in an advisory or consultant capacity to PHS. We're now going to discuss 3 case examples to give you a sense of what ORI case summaries tell us about research misconduct. And first, we're going to start with a pretty average scenario, so you get a sense of what things typically look like. And then we'll discuss 2 more unusual examples to illustrate areas that are potential points of concern. So let's start with case number 1. So let's discuss this case, which is our typical situation. In this case, it's a typical situation because the type of research misconduct and the type of sanctions involved are pretty middle of the road, pretty typical. In this case, the researcher was a former research track assistant professor at the Department of Toxicology and Cancer Biology at the University of Kentucky College of Medicine, where he conducted cancer research before he was found responsible for research misconduct. This researcher received a 4-year supervisory period for intentionally, knowingly, or recklessly falsifying and/or fabricating data in 4 published papers, 1 funded grant application, and 2 unfunded grant applications. And in addition to the 4-year supervisory period, HHS notified the journal where the research misconduct was published of the need for a retraction. Although in that case, HHS provided the notice, oftentimes the respondent themselves is responsible for making that retraction notification. So as an institution, that might be something that you would need to supervise as well. So in this case, what did the researcher do? The researcher fabricated Western blot data by reusing, relabeling, and manipulating images or using blank panels to falsely report data. On the slide, I have an example of what Western blot looks like. This isn't from this specific researcher, but it can kind of show you what misuse of that data might look like. So here, the top panel and the bottom panel are the same source image, but they're flipped horizontally. And it kind of gives you a sense of those might look like they're different research metrics, different blots, but they're actually the same data, just manipulated. So this situation, as we kind of discussed, reflects typical misconduct and a typical sanction. And many of the case summaries that we reviewed looked like this. So now that you know what a typical case looks like, we're going to move on to 2 more unusual cases. The second case centers on a former postdoctoral fellow at the McGovern Medical School at the University of Texas Health Science Center, where he conducted research using funding from the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Disease. This researcher was found responsible for knowingly and intentionally falsifying, fabricating, and plagiarizing the whole content of 6 papers and 8 manuscripts. And this conduct, I'm going to explain what it is. It sounds like the paper mills that Karen described earlier, but it's actually a little bit less sophisticated. So what happened here was that the researcher created pretend authors and listed these pretend authors as being affiliated with various research institutions. The researcher then submitted papers under the pretend authors' names for publication in open access preprint repositories. And while the papers Karen was describing often come across as reasonable, you might read them and find them to be comprehensible. In this case, ORI described the researcher's papers as, quote, random paragraphs of text, tables, and figures, end quote. These papers cited to the postdoctoral fellow so that he would improve his citation metrics. In this case, the researcher entered a voluntary exclusion agreement in which he agreed to exclude himself from contracting with any US government agency for 10 years, and he also agreed to exclude himself from serving in any advisory capacity to PHS. Now we'll move on to our third and final example. So this case actually implicates 2 researchers. It's evaluated by ORI separately, but the misconduct was identical across the 2 parties. So in this case, a former professor of orthopedic surgery and radiation oncology and a former research technician at Albert Einstein College of Medicine were found responsible for engaging in research misconduct. Their research focused on topics including stem cell therapies for tendon repair. Both researchers were found to have intentionally, knowingly, or recklessly falsified and/or fabricated data in the same 16 publications. Just like in our first example, these researchers falsified and/or fabricated Western blot data. They falsely claimed that these manipulations were real data from various experiments, and the researchers then used these manipulations to create over 50 figures and accompanying analysis based on no real research. In one instance, the researchers copied the blot panels and added an extra lane to the left, and then claimed that the new blot panels represented a different sample. After they were found responsible for the research misconduct, the professor agreed to have his research supervised for 12 years, and the research technician agreed to have his research supervised for 4 years. So they had different sanctions for engaging in the same misconduct, which I thought was interesting. And the website, the ORI case summary doesn't explain the reason for that discrepancy, but I do think it's important to note that even though they engaged in the same misconduct, the sanctions were different. We're now going to move on and discuss managing the risk and litigation trends. So those were examples of ORI case investigations, and now we're going to discuss specifically lawsuits that are happening in this area. And I think Karen's going to start us off contextually here, and then I'll provide some specific case examples.
Thanks, Catherine. Very helpful examples from ORI. So I just wanted to jump in here quickly to mention that, of course, a great deal of managing risk is preventing misconduct in the first place, as opposed to addressing it after the fact. So we'll elaborate on these ideas a little bit later, but just to mention a few thoughts. One of an institution's best tools for managing its risk with respect to research misconduct is to make sure that it has clear and up-to-date policies that are enforced consistently. That makes it easier on everyone, and it also, I think, gives fair warning to those who might engage in research misconduct as to what is likely to happen in that instance. We also recommend attention to the hiring process. Your institution may want to make sure that it's doing everything it can at the hiring stage within the bounds of what's legally permissible to make sure that you're hiring folks who have the training and experience needed to conduct research properly, and that you're careful with respect to hiring folks who may have engaged in research misconduct previously. Not to say that you'd never want to do that, but want to be able to do that as consciously as possible. So this is a subject you'd want to talk to legal counsel and HR about to make sure that you do as much as you can without creating any new employment-related liability. And finally, consider what technological solutions are already available to you or on the horizon. Perhaps your institution already has software to review for plagiarism. I know a lot of us adopted new software during COVID to account for the different risks of academic misconduct associated with remote testing and remote work. So perhaps that software is used with respect to students, but could it also be used for your own researchers' publications or the publications that your faculty members are peer reviewing? And also, are you making use of the publicly available websites that may be worth monitoring, such as Retraction Watch and even PubPeer, which we'll discuss in a little while? Not to say that those are perfectly reliable sources, but that monitoring them can give you a bit of a sense of at least what the chatter is out there, particularly on PubPeer, as to research misconduct. So with that, I will be quiet. Catherine will discuss some litigation trends, and then we'll turn back for one final section.
In reviewing recent litigation surrounding research misconduct, there are many areas which can give rise to litigation risk, but in this presentation, we're going to focus on 3 areas that emerge from the case law as posing a particular risk: defamation, due process, and retaliation. We'll talk through each of these claims and offer a case example to illustrate them, but this is at a very high level, so if you find yourself involved in litigation on these topics, you definitely don't want to rely just on this presentation. You should seek real legal advice. But an overview is, I think, helpful. So we'll first start with defamation. Often when an individual is accused of research misconduct, they may sue the university for sullying their name. Defamation claims are state law claims, so the specifics will vary depending on where your institution is located. But a key element of all defamation claims is that the statement must be false. So one way to avoid losing a defamation suit is to tell the truth. But you can't just say you're telling the truth. In order to prove to a court that you are telling the truth, documentation is essential. This means documenting the basis for your institution's statements and findings is particularly important. Now we'll move to the case example, which is Wang versus Board of Trustees of the University of Illinois. and it offers an example of the importance of telling the truth to avoid losing on a defamation claim. In this case, a former tenured professor who had been accused of research misconduct sued for defamation, among other things. The court held that the professor's defamation claims needed to be dismissed because the professor had admitted to engaging in the misconduct he had been accused of. Because the professor had admitted to the misconduct, the court treated it as true and therefore dismissed the defamation claims. And related to this, as Karen kind of alluded to before, we wanted to touch on PubPeer. PubPeer is a platform which allows concerned individuals to post concerns about research misconduct and allows anyone else to respond. Institutions should be aware that while such postings may bring light to important concerns about research misconduct, which of course is a good thing, they may also generate defamation or other forms of liability if the postings are not based on evidence. So you want to balance those risks when engaging in platforms or with platforms like PubPeer. Next, we're going to move on to due process, which is our next area of potential litigation risk. So this issue was raised in Helm versus Ratterman. In this case, a former medical school professor sued the University of Louisville School of Medicine. The professor claimed that the university had violated his due process rights because they did not follow their ORI policy guidelines, but instead followed the internal policy for research misconduct. Although the court dismissed the professor's claims as untimely, this case highlights the very important procedural requirement for research misconduct investigations, which is that institutions must identify at the outset of the investigation whether they are operating under their ORI policy or another institutional policy. Under the federal regulations, ORI inquiries and investigations must follow strict timelines, while internal policies can deviate from those guidelines. Some institutions choose to avoid this problem by conforming their internal policies to ORI guidance. In fact, ORI even offers template policies that institutions can adopt and tailor for internal use. In order to prevail on due process claims, it is best practice for institutions to clearly identify what policy will govern an investigation. Next, we'll move on to our last area of litigation risk, which is retaliation. Under the regulations, retaliation is an adverse action taken against a complainant, witness, or committee member by an institution or one of its members in response to A, a good faith allegation of research misconduct, or B, good faith cooperation with a research misconduct proceeding. Retaliation is, of course, impermissible. One case which addressed questions of retaliation was Joshi versus trustees of Columbia University in the city of New York. In this case, an anesthesiologist sued Columbia University College of Physicians and Surgeons after they closed his lab, and the anesthesiologist complained about research misconduct and alleged that the university had closed his lab in retaliation. In evaluating his claim, the court considered a variety of factors, including the amount of time between the reporting and the alleged retaliation, alternative explanations for lab closure, including lack of funding, and the fact that the individuals who were alleged to be retaliating had not worked at the university at the time of the report. The court ultimately concluded that the university had not retaliated against the professor and granted summary judgment in its favor. When conducting research misconduct investigations, it is essential to ensure that all parties involved know that retaliation is prohibited, and this is not only required by the regulations, but is also very important in promoting a culture of research integrity, which supports whistleblowers. And now Karen's going to talk a little bit more about other ways we can foster cultures of research integrity. Karen, I'm so sorry. A couple of us are having trouble hearing you.
Oh, sorry about that. I forgot to unmute myself. Man, 3 years of remote work and forgot to unmute. Here we are. So here's our last poll question. Don't worry, this data only appears in aggregated form. We're not going to report it to anyone, but we're interested in your own view of your institution's culture. And I'll just give a couple seconds for folks to weigh in here. Thanks for alerting me, Catherine. Okay, let's see what we've got. Okay, so it looks like folks have a lot of confidence in their institution's culture of research integrity. We have almost 50% strongly agree that there's a strong culture of research integrity. 25% agree somewhat. That's pretty good. And then we have 19% neither agree nor disagree, 6.3% disagree somewhat, and nearly 1% strongly disagree. So those last couple are a little bit concerning and maybe opportunities to think about some of what we'll be presenting in these last couple of minutes. As a follow-up, it would be sort of interesting to know if anyone has done a quantitative analysis on this on your campus, like a climate survey, but that's for another day. Okay, so just as a refresher, here's the regulatory requirement. Research institutions receiving funding for research from any of the PHS funders are expected to foster a research environment that promotes the responsible conduct of research, research training, and activities related to that research or research training, discourages research misconduct, excuse me, and deals promptly with allegations or evidence of possible research misconduct. So that's our mandate. And so we're interested in what does a culture of research integrity look like? You must have had something in mind when you answered that last poll question. One formulation is a gauge of trust. There's an interesting sort of short article on this that I'm citing on the slide. And that focuses on creating a community of support, understanding, and opportunity to engage in research that is appropriate and not compromised in any way. From a lawyer's perspective, I tend to think more about creating trust by settling expectations. And we do that by having clear policies, consistent implementation of those policies, and that minimizes guessing about what will happen. Another hallmark of a culture of research integrity is abundant training opportunities, education, and reinforcement. By reinforcement, what we're really talking about is weaving these themes throughout campus. Students and new hires should hear about them at onboarding, faculty and staff should hear about them in department meetings, and any sorts of promotion and reappointment reviews should include this discussion. And this bullet point here on adopting a broader perspective, just to sort of summarize what I would have said about that, the idea is that we tend to think of research misconduct as sort of an individual problem. We have one bad actor or respondent. If they're found liable, they are responsible, they're a bad actor. We have maybe one whistleblower, and it's all sort of individualistic. What we're suggesting here is adopting a broader perspective. And I have an article to commend to you, actually from last year, very recently, that gives some ideas about thinking structurally about and socially about how research misconduct arises. And because any research misconduct doesn't happen in a vacuum, it happens somewhere with somebody supervising. So we might ask ourselves, why did this respondent engage in research misconduct? Why did they think they could get away with it? And to what extent were they right? I mean, maybe they got away with it for years and were only caught because of some kind of flukes. So besides the threat of discipline, what other influences can our institutions offer to counteract the incentive to boost publication through cutting corners? We have some best practice considerations here. First, related to this idea of reinforcing research integrity or using the language of professional ethics throughout your institution, we recommend raising the visibility of the RIO if you have one, or whoever's responsible for research misconduct. You can see some of the other ideas here, relying on the rigor of the processes you already have for human and animal research, providing training opportunities and support for researchers. I am particularly obsessed with data storage and data organization as one of those places where QRPs tend to happen the most. Making sure you have the right array of reporting options for those who suspect research misconduct is happening. Look for opportunities to coordinate with journals or publishers in situations other than just telling them it's time to retract something or calling something into question. And finally, internal and external monitoring. Someone in the comments suggested internal audits. I think that can be really useful. Also, these external websites are opportunities to just keep your eye on things that are happening outside your institution. I have a news alert for research misconduct, which I recommend, but also don't, because it comes up an awful lot. So you'll get a lot of news in your inbox. So looking ahead to more sweeping changes in our last minute, one thought is going back to what Catherine's author called stupid systems, thinking about what our institution's role is in promoting sort of a publisher parish culture. How do we count citations and what weight do we give those counts? Do we want to make any adjustments to those? What is the weight that we're giving, if any, to mentoring of junior researchers or supervising your own research? Those are all really important. And then finally, focusing additional attention on faculty members who are serving as peer reviewers. Maybe they need some training and support. And like I said, it'd be interesting to have climate studies in this area on those campuses that have very significant research enterprises. And with that, yep. Hello, Annie.
I see that we're out of time, and we certainly understand if those of you who are at time need to drop off, but we did have one question that I thought was super interesting, and I would love for the two of you to stay on because it deals with how we implement our responses when we get allegations of research misconduct. And the question is, what if we receive a report of an issue with a particular researcher, but the conduct is just QRPs and not research misconduct? How would you recommend that schools consider addressing that?
Catherine, I'll take this one. I actually think this is something that that NIH video on YouTube may have sort of touched on, but not quite in this context. So let me think about it for a second. What I think I'm hearing is that the institution has received a report of allegations that, even if they're true, would be questionable research practices, but would not be fabrication, falsification, or plagiarism. So if that's the question, it's tough because if you know that there are substandard practices in a particular lab or other setting, you want to address it, but you also want to strike a balance between promoting research integrity and also addressing whatever misconduct might be underlying there. So, and we don't want our faculty or research staff to feel like we're always watching them or we're not on the same team with them. So let's start with the question of what would you do with the allegations? I guess at this point, you pull out your policy, your research misconduct policy, you do the initial assessment, and I think you'd need to look at whether the allegations were sufficiently credible and specific. That's what you're looking for, to determine that there's jurisdiction over them and that it falls into the definition of research misconduct. So the hypo says that the conduct is just QRPs, but there can be QRPs that you could reasonably find fall within the definition of research misconduct, particularly if it has to do with the data, like if the allegation is that the researcher is ignoring or cutting out outliers in the data, excluding it from whatever the resulting study is going to be. So depending on the situation, there could be QRPs that you find the allegations are sufficient that it falls within research misconduct, and you proceed to your inquiry stage. If you really find that the alleged conduct just doesn't fit the definition of research misconduct, then you might consider whether there's another policy outside of the research misconduct context that could apply. Like some places have either the unit or the institution has like a catch-all statement on research standards or on professionalism. And you could kind of shoehorn this into that so that you'd refer the allegations to someone else for whatever investigation was appropriate under that policy. And in that investigation, they might uncover research misconduct and refer it back to you to start over at the assessment stage. If that doesn't happen, you know, it's always worth considering whether there might be like a proactive, non-disciplinary approach. Like perhaps the institution could find a way to offer resources to the researcher that would address the issue, maybe some administrative support, maybe incentivize some training if you know that they're falling short in some area. So I hope that answers the question. I think that's how I would approach it. One other thing though, I think if the allegations came to you from a whistleblower, remember that we also have obligation toward that person in both not only the inquiry and the investigation, but even if you don't make it past the assessment stage, you now have a person who believes something is wrong in their work environment. Now they think that nothing's going to be done about it. And they've also put themselves out there hoping to, you know, create some change. So this is where you might want to get creative, see what changes that person might need in order to be comfortable with the practices in their lab. That might be illuminating. You might be able to facilitate some kind of conversation, or even look to other lab settings, look to their colleagues for some ideas on ways to improve the research environment so that the whistleblower doesn't feel like they've just put themselves out there for nothing, and they're forced to continue to work in an environment that they think is not being handled appropriately. So I've just rambled on and on about that question. I apologize. I hope that was helpful analysis. If you have a different approach, I'd really be interested in it, because I suspect this is something that happens more often than we hear about. But thank you for that question.
And thank you for that answer. One thing I will add is, particularly at, say, academic medical centers where you have the researcher in a particular area, and you might have a research fellow who really doesn't have any other choice in the nation for opportunities to do this same work, but in that researcher's lab. We've seen schools put in place what they're calling non-retaliation plans to arrange for things like someone else to review them, or other added protections for that whistleblower or person who, as you said, Karen, has put themselves out there to report. With that, we are clearly out of time, and we thank you all for joining us today. Thank you, Karen and Catherine, for that overview and update on recent developments and trends and case laws in this area. And thank you again to our audience for joining us. The program has, again, been approved for complimentary continuing legal education. To report your hours, click the CEU icon at the bottom of your screen, and a certificate of attendance and a recording of the webinar will be sent to you tomorrow for sharing. Be sure to complete our survey so that we can use your feedback to provide more webinars going forward that best meet the interests and the needs of your institution. That concludes our webinar. Thanks, everyone.